To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.
Welcome to the Death Panel. Patrons, thank you so much for supporting the show. None of the work that we do would be possible without you. To become a supporter of the show and get access to the second weekly bonus episode, as well as the entire back catalog of bonus episodes, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. And to help us out a little more, share the show with your friends, hold listening or discussion groups, post about your favorite episodes, pick up copies of Health Communism, A Short History of Transmisogyny, and Abolish Rent at your local bookstore, or request them at your local library, and follow us at deathpanel_. I'm Beatrice Bolton, and I'm here today with my co-host, Tracy Rosenthal.
Hi.
And today's episode is the second in a series that we've been developing with Tracy, centered around the growing tenants movement and their book, co-authored with Leonardo Vilches, called Abolish Rent: How Tenants Can End the Housing Crisis. If you haven't heard the first two episodes in this series, back in September, we had Tracy on alongside their co-author Leonardo for a conversation about their book, Abolish Rent. And that episode also serves as a prologue to the series. And then for the first episode in the series, in early November, we had Annie Powers on to talk about the history of unhoused people's organizing and land struggle. And we're so excited to be bringing you the next episode in this series with Tracy, where we're joined by Marques Vestal to talk about the history of political relations to land in Los Angeles, California. Marques Vestal is an urban historian studying the social history of residential property in Black Los Angeles during the rebellious 20th century. His work links property conflict to the everyday contracts, solicitations, complaints, lawsuits, and murders over property, to broader transformations of real estate, urban development, and Black liberation, and centers around a few key political relations to land: property, housing insecurity, municipal incapacity, and racial capitalism. Mark is also an assistant professor of urban planning and critical Black urbanism at UCLA, and is a member of the Los Angeles Tenants Union. He's working on his first book, tentatively titled Eviction in the Promised Land: A History of Race and Property from Skid Row to Watts. Mark, welcome to the Death Panel. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm so excited to talk to you about your work.
What's good? Thank you for having me.
Now, just to start us off here, Tracy, can you briefly tell listeners a little about why you wanted to have Mark join us for this series about your book, Abolish Rent?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so happy, Mark, that you're here. I know Mark as one of Los Angeles Tenant Union's first arrests for union organizing. And it was in that context that, I learned about his research after his organizing in solidarity with our food not rent strike during the, early months of the pandemic. And being in conversation with him, I think, has really been, this whole series is really about me turning the mic on the people who made that book possible. And, we had Annie on talking about our organizing in Echo Park Lake and their research on the National Homeless Union. And, when I was thinking about who to ask, I realized that I so often have Mark in my head when I'm thinking about the role of the state and state violence in what underlies our housing system, in thinking about our legal system as a process of automating that violence. I think about Mark's work when I think about how our housing system is implicated in forms of population control, and just the way that property and housing is one of the central mechanisms, to put it in Stuart Hall's terms, that race is the modality through which class is lived. And his research on race and property, there aren't a lot of people whose dissertations I read, but I read Mark's. And so I'm really glad that he's here. And I hope that was sufficiently embarrassing. I apologize.
Tracy, thank you for laying out that context. Now, Mark, I'm so excited to get into your work. For listeners that aren't familiar with you, can you just talk a little bit about what you do and contextualize your research focus for folks?
Yeah, so I'm interested, like when you gave my bio, you said property conflict. So when I started doing this research years and years and years ago, the kind of moment where I started asking questions about property is when I witnessed the murder of a man outside of my apartment in South LA. He was 63 years old and he was shot in the street. And when I went outside and I noticed the victim, the spectators, everyone was Black. And I think that's when I started asking questions about segregation. And then when I started looking more into segregation, it was like, well, we kind of already knew like what happened in terms of urban history. Then I started to think more deeply is the fact that like we were paying rent to be there. Like it wasn't free. Like we were all exposed to all of this violence and we were there paying rent. And the way that we got there was through an eviction.
Mm.
And so it started making me think more about the everyday struggles over property. And I got a sense that we didn't really have a lot of urban history that took that on, especially when it came to race, because we were so focused on, for very good reason, we were very focused and still are on segregation. So I felt like our conversations about race and property have more to do about where Black people could live, which I kind of call like a history of the back door. I was more concerned with the history of the front door. What do we do? What do we do over conflicts about rent, eviction, taxes, stuff like that? So that's the kind of overview of why I'm interested in property conflict and trying to figure out like over 50 years, I'm looking at all of this violence, these contracts, these solicitations, these complaints, lawsuits, and sometimes murders or acts of violence, and trying to find the through line. Like, how do I make sense of all of this conflict? And so that led to this book that I'm trying to write that's getting on my last nerves. But I think what I realized looking at property conflict between the late 19th century to the Watts Rebellion in 1965 is that at base, these conflicts over things like rent and taxes and habitability, but also tenure, they have to do with eviction at its root.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, like you and I have talked about eviction, that like it needs a better name. The word itself doesn't really do justice to the amount of violence that goes into it and the hole that it rips in the social fabric of communities that experience it. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit more about eviction itself. Like in your research, I think you situate it in this long history, and I think you've referred to it in the past as a constellation of powers. So how did you get to that understanding of what eviction is?
No, that's a great question. Thank you. Well, shit, like it's been a long time coming. I've been struggling over this question because I wasn't initially interested in eviction. I was just interested in all the bullshit that was happening. Like, yeah, I would be looking inside of the newspaper, the Black newspapers, and looking at like comic strips and gossip rags and all of this conflict, all of this shit talking that was happening about property and things like rent. And I think eviction became so important because at the end of the day, like me and you were talking the other day about rent raises, and you mentioned them as polite evictions. And for that to make sense, then we would need to have an understanding of all these other powers that come to bear on property and really occupancy. Like I was part of what I was trying to understand, like what's at root here in terms of the fundamental conflicts over property and where we live. And initially, when I started doing this research, I was thinking about things like housing insecurity, because that's like the language that came to me through social science in the university. But it didn't really work for folks that were unhoused. Usually when we think about housing insecurity, we think about folks that are in formal housing. So like that didn't really get at it, because I'm looking at situations where people are living like in the river bottom at the turn of the 20th century and they're getting put out. So is it about housing insecurity? Is it about shelter? And so it seems like it was at root, there were conflicts over occupancy because they're happening across different tenures, and they're happening in very different kinds of like submarkets, like throughout Los Angeles. So occupancy was a big one. And then eviction, and you're so right, like we need a new word, because when I initially started looking at just the concept of eviction, and I would go and I would read articles by like, especially like legal scholars, and eviction was mostly described in one or two ways. One would be like an illegal detainer, where it's just like the landlord goes to court to get you thrown out for whatever reason. And then there was this broader category of evictions, like constructive evictions. Like if there's a hole in your roof and it's raining and you can't live there, then you're like constructively evicted. But when I was looking especially at this one case study with George Farley, who was a homeowner in Los Angeles in the 1920s and the 1930s. And when I looked at his eviction, and it was so special because he killed two Los Angeles sheriff's deputies that came to evict him in 1938. When I went to look at his eviction, I found out that he was a tenant that day in February of 1938. But before that, he was a homeowner. And when I traced back how that his property was foreclosed on, then that revealed a predatory debt market that was connected to Los Angeles's road and street modernization throughout the early 20th century. So that got into all kinds of stuff like liens, like the like a lien that you would like a mechanic would put on your car. So there was like this long chain of other legal relationships that didn't necessarily have to do with the lease. And I guess one way of thinking about it is that evictions exceed the lease agreement. And I think the Los Angeles Tenants Union has helped me think about these relationships more broadly, really because of its challenge around tenancy, is that tenants are anyone who don't control their own housing, so that we start thinking about tenancy outside of a lease agreement. And I think looking at the history of eviction or the history of the front door, the history of people getting put out, that eviction also exceeds tenancy. And so it's then what are these other powers, for example, a lien on a street improvement bond or public health powers, for example, this what I'm working on in my first chapter. So that's like where the constellation of powers to remove kinds of come from as a definition of eviction.
I really appreciate the way that you talk really about evictions in terms of a kind of system of governance, which is, I feel like, what you're kind of getting at here a little bit. Do you think you could talk a little bit about, I was watching a talk that you did from 2022 called Property in the Promised Land, where you talked about this specific case, and in the Q&A, you described property as the daily administration of racial capitalism. And that feels very key to kind of what you're setting up here, which is that this is not just about, something being entered on the legal record or the paperwork being filed, but about using the law, using governance, using all sorts of different strategies of the state to really designate and take ownership over place and space in a way that I think runs counter to the kind of traditional way of thinking of ownership, right, as a kind of absolute right. And I think it's such an important point that you make. And I would love if you would just kind of get into that or riff on that for a second.
Yeah, thank you. And like, also thank you for like going back and looking at that lecture. And sometimes people tell me, they say things back to me that I said in the past. And I'm like, I said that? So maybe one way I can get into this is, for Black Americans in the United States, property ownership is such a deeply important goal of racial liberation. And when I got into this research, I noticed in most of the scholarship on the history of race, property, and housing that homeownership was this golden throne of American citizenship. And like one way of trying to put a metric on the distance we've traveled from slavery to freedom is the rate of home ownership in the Black community. So like a common one for Los Angeles was that 40% of Black Angelenos owned their home in 1910 in Los Angeles, and then would use that as they could live here and they could live there and they could buy property and look, there's this freedom. And when I ran across that George Farley case, and him and his wife, Cora Farley, they own this property. They fully paid it off. And they were a part of that 40% who owned a property, this kind of snapshot of like who owns and who doesn't. And they still had their property taken away. And it wasn't like a mistake. It was part of a system of capturing value from real estate in order to raise capital to build stuff like streetlights and sidewalks and paving roads. So this like holy grail of property under capitalism in the United States as ownership, there was a conversation we weren't having about it, especially when it came to like racially marginalized people. And so that's when I started to think about, there's something deeper going on here with property, like whether you were an owner or you were a tenant, If you were Black, you were still in the hood, you were still segregated. So that property market for Los Angeles was like a historic Central Avenue. That entire property market is serving racial capitalism in some way.
Mm-hmm.
So even if folks are owning property, even if they're paying rent, there's still something going on there in terms of extraction, even if we have a better understanding of what that looks like for a tenant, because we could easily see it in the rent relation. There was something going on with property, with ownership, especially racially marginal ownership, that I figured we weren't understanding. And so that case study, that was the first one where it really broke it open for me that there's this deeper question and interrogation of property under racial capitalism that I wanted to get into, really to undermine that myth and the fact that we've been trying to own property in the city for over a century and like this shit ain't working. So that's like what I want to get at in terms of thinking about property as the daily administration of racial capitalism. And then when I for the book project, so like the dissertation that I wrote was dealing with Black Los Angeles from basically like the 1920s through the 1950s. And so when I had this opportunity to write this book, I wasn't satisfied with this concept of property conflict. Like, yeah, I did find this case study about a tax foreclosure, but I didn't really have a way of threading that into a broader story, one about tenancy and about the development, the urban development over the course of the, let's say, from 1900 to 1965, which is the Watts Rebellion. I didn't really have an understanding of how property, all that property conflict was telling a story about the history of the city and the history of race. Mm-hmm. So I started pressing back first instead of pushing forward past 1950 to move towards the Watts Rebellion. I wanted to look deeper into the past, and that drive to look backwards in time, I think that came from an important mentor of mine, Kelly Leiter Hernandez, who wrote an incredible book, several incredible books, but the one in particular that I'm thinking about is City of Inmates. And it's a history of mass incarceration in Los Angeles. And it takes on very squarely the question of incarceration and settler colonialism. And so Kelly Leiter Hernandez had been really, it might have been like one sentence that it was a feedback that she gave me when I was, what do you call it, going up for candidacy for my doctoral degree. And I was, when I was doing my proposal, I was talking all this shit about housing insecurity. It was housing insecurity. I'm interested in housing insecurity. Da, da, da. And Kelly just like, it might have been the only feedback she gave me. She said, think about land. Mm. And I was like, okay, like, what the fuck does that mean? Like, you know, so it's like, so then I spend, and that's what's the great thing about this. So then I spend years with that question in my head, think about land. And so I had this opportunity to extend this analysis both in time and to get down into the dirt, like get down into the land. So I noticed this great history of, so I mentioned George Farley and this property where he shot these two deputy marshals. The company that subdivided that's the subdivision where he bought his land, there was another historian, Kim Hernandez, who wrote this great history on the Los Angeles Investment Company. This is the company that subdivided this land. And she revealed that company insiders called their first subdivision, which wasn't the George Farley subdivision. It was another one on the other side of the east side of Alameda, I believe. And they marketed specifically to Black Angelenos, but just racially marginalized people. And so company insiders called it the Tin Can Tract as a reference to its proximity to the city dump, which used to be located like on Washington and Santa Fe near the Los Angeles River. So then I'm like, what's up with this tin can kind of river bottom geography? And when I started rooting around in the newspaper about tin cans, then I find another eviction of a sex worker who lived in the Los Angeles River bottom in 1900. And that opened up a case study that opens my book about the history of a historic Skid Row. And then that case study that took me 2 or 3 years to figure out, like I'm just now figuring it out. That's what really helped me, like looking at this case study of historic Skid Row And what that ended up being, we could talk more about it, but the history of house courts in Los Angeles, and then comparing that with the history that I wrote in my dissertation, that's what allowed me to think more, I think, in a streamlined fashion about what's the purpose of the daily what's one of the purposes of the daily administration of property under racial capitalism. And one of them is using eviction to fashion property markets for things like city development, war making, and dealing with the consequences of the urban crisis. So that's kind of a big framing of all that stuff about like property and racial capitalism and all that good shit.
I mean, I so appreciate that. And I think for me, thinking about like eviction as the power to put out or the power to remove or the power to dispossess, it's also about like creating classes of exploitability, right? And in so doing, you create classes of exploitability and you create property that has value. And I feel like that, part of your work is about establishing the role of eviction and like the role of removal in producing property value, right? Like in fact, as you said, in fashioning property markets. And also I feel like in producing classes of exploitability. I think about that opening line of Kelly Hernandez's book, which it's so haunting, which is incarceration is elimination. I think we have also talked a lot about the role of banishment in producing property and property value. And I wonder, I guess I just, my question is about that relationship, right? The relationship between producing property value and producing classes of exploitable and like banishable subjects, right?
Right. Yeah, that's such a dope question. And this is I just now figured this out. Like this opening chapter of my book, looking at historic Skid Row. So it's basically one common way we think about eviction, not us, but maybe like a liberal or some shit like that, is like, okay, so eviction is something that happens to poor people. Like the problem of eviction is a problem of poverty. And people don't have enough. Yes, I'm coming at Matthew Desmond. Like, let's just, like,
he can take it.
Yeah, he can take it. He got plenty of money to take it.
Got as much power as a U.S. senator.
And so it's like, and it's not that it's wrong, right? Like poverty is an issue. Poverty is a problem. And one of the consequences of being impoverished in the United States, along with like a lack of rent control, a lack of support for tenant unions and all of that, is the consequence of eviction. But it's not the only thing that eviction is used for under racial capitalism. And it gets directly at what Tracy was just talking about, is that it helps produce property value and it also helps produce property itself. And in early Los Angeles, so basically in the late 19th century.
To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. You'll get access to this and the rest of our catalog of patron-only episodes, and be the first to get a new patron episode every Monday when it drops. With love, the Death Panel.